A white police officer pepper-sprayed a young black boy, completely unaware of who the boy's father was. What happened next would leave everyone speechless. The sun shone brightly over the bustling neighborhood as Elijah, a young black boy, walked along the sidewalk. His backpack hung loosely over one shoulder, its worn strap swaying with each step. Elijah was in a cheerful mood, his mind filled with excitement about the games he planned to play with his friends at the park. The world around him was alive with movement, the laughter of children playing in a nearby yard, the distant hum of passing cars, and the occasional bark of a dog. The hum of passing cars and the chatter of pedestrians filled the air, but Elijah barely noticed. His thoughts were elsewhere, focused on the simple joys that awaited him. The park had always been his refuge, a place where he could leave his worries behind and just be a kid. He adjusted his backpack, quickening his pace as he pictured his friends already gathered by their favorite bench, laughing and waiting for him to arrive. Just a few blocks away, inside a small convenience store, a young police officer stood by the counter, casually observing the customers as they moved through the aisles. The officer ignored the need for proper evidence, allowing his bias to cloud his judgment. At that moment, as Elijah walked past the shop, the officer glanced through the large glass window and spotted him. Unaware of the scrutiny, Elijah kept his eyes on the horizon, his mind still set on the park ahead. But the officer's gaze hardened, locking onto the boy with a determination that had little to do with reason or fairness. Without hesitation, he stepped out of the store, his demeanor immediately aggressive, despite the fact that Elijah's clothing did not even match the vague description given. The officer convinced himself that he had found the culprit. To him, the mere fact that Elijah was a black boy near the shop was enough. Without hesitation, he reached for the can of pepper spray on his belt, gripping it firmly as he advanced toward the boy. Elijah only noticed the officer when he was just a few steps away. Confused by the man's intense focus on him, he slowed his pace, unsure of what was happening. Before he could utter a single word, the officer suddenly raised the can and sprayed him directly in the face. A sharp, searing pain struck Elijah instantly, the burning sensation overwhelming his senses. His vision blurred as the fiery sting of the spray blinded him. A searing pain spread across Elijah's eyes and face. He let out a startled cry, his backpack slipping from his shoulder and landing on the ground as he stumbled backward. His hands flew to his face, desperately trying to wipe away the burning sensation. But the pain only grew worse. His vision blurred, his tears mixing with the harsh residue of the spray, making it impossible to see. His mind raced, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. Why had the officer attacked him? What had he done to deserve this? Panic gripped him, fear settling deep in his chest as the world around him turned into a haze of confusion and pain. Fear and confusion overwhelmed Elijah as he stood there, clutching his face and gasping for breath. The officer, however, showed no concern for the boy's suffering. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and grabbed Elijah roughly by the arm. Elijah flinched at the harsh contact, his body trembling as he instinctively tried to pull away. His cries of protest went unheard as the officer tightened his grip, dragging him toward the patrol car parked nearby. His legs struggled to carry him as he was forced forward, his mind consumed by panic and pain. Each step felt unsteady, his vision still blurred from the burning spray. He stumbled, his knees buckling slightly, but the officer's relentless grip never loosened. The officer didn't slow down. Instead, he yanked Elijah forward, his actions cold and unfeeling. The bustling street around them seemed to blur into the background as Elijah's world shrank to two things: the unbearable sting in his eyes and the relentless grip of the officer's hand. Passers-by glanced at the scene, some with curiosity, others with concern, but no one stepped in. The officer's authority loomed too large, and Elijah's desperate pleas were swallowed by the indifference of the crowd. As the patrol car came into view, his heart pounded harder, dread sinking into his chest. Elijah's heart sank even further. He felt powerless, unable to comprehend how a simple walk to the park had turned into a nightmare. Desperately, he tried once more to explain, his voice shaking as he insisted he had done nothing wrong. But the officer wasn't interested in listening. With a curt, sharp command, he ordered Elijah to be quiet. Then, without hesitation, he yanked open the patrol car door and shoved the boy inside, his movements rough and impatient. Elijah fell onto the seat, his hands still pressed against his face as the burning sensation refused to fade. A moment later, the door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing in his ears. He sat there, trapped, his body trembling, his mind reeling. Shaking and crying, Elijah sat in the back of the patrol car as the officer circled around and climbed into the driver's seat. His expression was unreadable, his eyes cold and devoid of sympathy. Through the rearview mirror, he glanced at Elijah, but there was no sign of hesitation or remorse. Without another word, he started the engine and drove toward the station, leaving Elijah's backpack abandoned on the sidewalk. As the car pulled away, Elijah leaned his head against the seat, his chest rising and falling with uneven sobs. He couldn't see where they were going, and he had no idea what awaited him at the station. All he knew was that he was scared, confused, and utterly alone. And now, Elijah was alone. At the police station, the junior officer yanked him out of the patrol car, gripping his arm tightly as he led him through the front entrance. Elijah's face was a mess, red and swollen, the aftermath of the pepper spray painfully clear. He blinked furiously, his vision still blurred, stumbling forward as he struggled to see. His tears mixed with the residue on his skin, streaking his cheeks and making his discomfort all the more evident. The officer didn't offer a word of comfort. He simply dragged Elijah inside, his pace brisk and unrelenting, as if the boy's suffering meant nothing at all. The officer's grip remained firm, his pace brisk and unrelenting, forcing Elijah to shuffle quickly just to keep up. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the searing pain in his eyes and face made it nearly impossible to focus on where they were going. Once inside, the officer pushed open a heavy metal door, leading Elijah into a small, dimly lit interrogation room. The walls were bare, except for a clock ticking noisily above the door. In the center of the room sat a single metal chair, its legs scuffed from years of use. The officer didn't bother easing Elijah inside. Instead, he shoved him forward without a second thought, his actions as cold as ever. Instead of guiding him into the space, the officer shoved Elijah roughly into the chair. He landed awkwardly, his knees scraping against the edge of the seat. His hands gripped the armrests tightly, his breaths coming in short, shallow gasps as the burning from the pepper spray continued to sting his skin. He barely had time to adjust to his surroundings before the officer returned with a damp cloth. Without warning, the man grabbed Elijah's chin and began scrubbing his face with rough, impatient movements. There was no care in his touch, no concern for the boy's discomfort, only the mechanical act of wiping away the evidence of what had been done to him. The damp, cold cloth should have brought relief, but the officer's callous handling only added to Elijah's misery. He flinched as the fabric scraped against the tender skin around his eyes, the pain sharp and unrelenting. Instinctively, he tried to pull away, but the officer's grip on his chin tightened, forcing him to remain still. With mechanical indifference, the officer wiped at the residue, his rough movements showing no concern for the boy's suffering. When he finally tossed the cloth onto the table with a loud thud, Elijah's face was still red and blotchy. Though his vision had cleared slightly, his eyes continued to sting, the lingering burn refusing to fade. The lingering burn on Elijah's skin made every movement uncomfortable, but the officer gave him no time to recover. Without hesitation, he launched into the interrogation, his voice sharp and demanding as he leaned in close. His first question wasn't truly a question. It was an accusation disguised as one. He demanded to know why Elijah had stolen from the shop. Elijah froze, his mind racing. He opened his mouth to respond, but the officer didn't give him the chance. Instead, he continued speaking, his tone growing harsher with each word. He berated the boy for a crime he hadn't committed, his words laced with judgment and disdain, leaving no room for innocence. Each word landed like a verbal blow, sharp with anger and prejudice. The officer didn't just accuse Elijah of theft, he made sweeping generalizations, blaming black people for the decline of the neighborhood. His remarks were cutting, filled with disdain, each one dripping with bias. He wasn't interested in the truth. Instead, he seemed to relish the opportunity to vent his frustrations at someone who couldn't fight back. His words carried nothing but contempt, each one making Elijah feel smaller, more powerless. Elijah's voice trembled as he tried to speak, but the weight of the officer's accusations pressed down on him, making it harder to find his words. Through his tears, Elijah tried to explain himself. His voice wavered as he protested that he hadn't stolen anything. He told the officer that he had only been on his way to the park to meet his friends, that he didn't even know what theft the man was referring to. But his words came out in broken fragments, interrupted by the sobs that shook his small frame. The officer, however, dismissed Elijah's explanation without a second thought. With a frustrated wave of his hand, he cut the boy off mid-sentence. His tone grew sharper, more insistent as he pressed Elijah for answers, demanding that he confess to the crime whether he had committed it or not. The officer leaned in closer, his shadow falling over Elijah like a dark cloud. His accusations came faster now, each one hurled with growing intensity. Elijah shook his head vigorously, his tears falling faster as he pleaded with the officer to believe him. His voice trembled as he insisted he was telling the truth, that he hadn't stolen anything, that he had done nothing wrong, but his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officer's frustration mounted with every denial. His voice rose, his accusations bouncing off the bare walls of the small room, each echo adding to the suffocating weight pressing down on Elijah. The atmosphere grew heavier with every passing moment, the air thick with hostility and fear. With each passing moment, Elijah's sobs filled the air, raw and unrelenting, as he struggled to defend himself. But the officer remained unmoved. He continued to push, his questions growing sharper, more pointed. He demanded to know why Elijah had taken the items and what he had planned to do with them, his tone laced with accusation, as if guilt had already been decided. Even as Elijah desperately maintained his innocence, the officer refused to listen. The interrogation escalated. The officer began pacing back and forth in front of the chair, his movements agitated, his voice edged with impatience. Elijah, still trembling, hunched forward, his body tense and small under the weight of the moment. Elijah hunched over slightly, his hands gripping the edge of the chair, as though it were the only thing keeping him grounded. His body trembled, his breath shaky and uneven. The officer's words cut deeper with each repetition, his accusations turning more vicious. He no longer spoke only of Elijah, he made sweeping generalizations, twisting his words into something uglier. He accused the boy of being just like the others, blaming him for the same problems he claimed were ruining the community. Elijah wasn't seen as an individual anymore. He was being painted as part of something bigger, something the officer resented. The barrage of insults and assumptions felt relentless, like blows he couldn't escape. No matter what he said, no matter how hard he tried to explain, it was as if his innocence had never even been an option. He felt trapped, hopeless. No matter how many times Elijah insisted he was innocent, the officer refused to believe him. His mind was already made up, and he seemed determined to force a confession whether it was true or not. The more Elijah protested, the more aggressive the officer became. His frustration boiled over into outright hostility, his tone sharp and accusing. The room felt suffocating, the tension thick and unyielding as the confrontation dragged on. Elijah's cries grew louder, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. He was exhausted both physically and emotionally. The constant accusations, the relentless pressure, and the sheer helplessness of it all drained him. It felt as though, no matter what he said, nothing would change. The constant barrage of accusations only deepened Elijah's sense of despair. Despite his fear and confusion, he clung to the truth, refusing to admit to something he hadn't done. It felt futile his words were powerless against the officer's unwavering conviction, but still, he wouldn't lie. Each denial was met with more anger, more accusations, and more disdain. The interrogation dragged on, minutes stretching into what felt like hours as Elijah endured the relentless questioning. His tears had soaked the front of his shirt, his small frame shaking with each sob. But the officer showed no sign of stopping. Though visibly frustrated, the officer showed no sign of letting up. His determination to paint Elijah as guilty overshadowed any concern for the truth. The room remained filled with the sound of Elijah's sobs, broken and raw, clashing against the officer's sharp, unyielding words. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the weight of injustice. The interrogation room had become a scene of rising hostility. Elijah sat slumped in the chair, his small frame trembling as sobs racked his body. His tear-streaked face was a mask of fear and confusion, his swollen eyes darting helplessly toward the officer who loomed over him, relentless in his pursuit of a confession that would never come. The junior officer continued pacing back and forth, his agitation growing with each of Elijah's denials. His frustration boiled over, his voice rising as he repeated the same accusations, ones that were no closer to the truth than when the interrogation had begun. He barked questions at Elijah, demanding answers to crimes the boy had not committed. Each word came sharper, harsher, pressing for a confession that would never come. Then, suddenly, the sound of the door creaking open cut through the heated exchange. The junior officer turned abruptly, his words faltering as a senior officer stepped into the room. The shift in the air was immediate. The weight of unchecked authority that had filled the space just moments before now wavered, replaced by something else entirely. The senior officer paused just inside the doorway, his gaze falling on the boy slumped in the chair. Elijah looked up at the sound of the door opening, his teary eyes meeting those of the newcomer. For the first time since the ordeal had begun, someone wasn't looking at him with hostility. Concern flickered across the senior officer's face as he took in the boy's disheveled appearance, the blotchy redness of his skin, the lingering wetness of tears streaking his cheeks, the way his shoulders sagged in defeat. There was something familiar about him, something that stirred a vague recognition in the officer's mind. His expression softened, and when he finally spoke, his tone was calm, almost careful, a stark contrast to the aggression that had filled the room moments before. The warmth in the senior officer's voice was a sharp contrast to the aggression that had filled the room moments earlier. He greeted Elijah with an air of calm, his words steady and reassuring. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone carrying a gentleness that felt almost foreign in the harsh environment of the interrogation room. Elijah blinked, unsure how to respond. After everything he had endured, the sudden shift in tone was jarring. He opened his mouth to answer, but before he could get a word out, the junior officer stepped forward, his posture rigid with self-assurance. His tone, now edged with triumph, interrupted the moment. Gesturing toward Elijah, he began explaining the situation with what he assumed was a confident, justified account, one that placed all blame on the boy sitting before them. The junior officer straightened, a sense of authority radiating from him, as he began to recount how he had apprehended the boy. His voice carried the confidence of someone who believed he had accomplished something significant. With an air of self-importance, he detailed Elijah's supposed role in the shop theft, speaking as if his version of events was indisputable. He gestured toward the boy as though presenting irrefutable evidence, fully expecting his actions to be met with approval. But the senior officer's expression shifted almost immediately. The moment the junior officer called Elijah a thief, confusion and doubt clouded his face. His brows knitted together as he glanced back at the boy, studying him more closely. Something wasn't adding up. A flicker of disbelief crossed the senior officer's face. Something wasn't adding up. He raised a hand, halting the junior officer's explanation. His tone remained firm but calm as he pressed for clarification. "What exactly do you mean by calling this boy a thief?" His question was sharp and direct, cutting through the junior officer's attempt to embellish the story further. For a moment, the junior officer hesitated, but then he doubled down on his accusation. Pointing toward Elijah once more, he repeated his claims, detailing how he had spotted the boy near the store and assumed him to be the culprit. His voice carried the same conviction as before, as if his version of events could not be questioned. The junior officer continued, his voice growing more insistent as he laid out his version of events. He described how he had spotted Elijah outside the shop, and how the boy's supposed suspicious behavior had warranted immediate apprehension. His tone carried the confidence of someone expecting validation, as if his actions were beyond reproach. But as the junior officer spoke, the senior officer's expression changed. His eyes widened in shock as realization dawned on him. The familiarity he had felt upon first seeing Elijah now clicked into place, the missing puzzle pieces finally aligning. Confusion gave way to certainty, and in that instant, the senior officer understood the gravity of the mistake that had been made. He shook his head, his stance shifting, his voice steady, but laced with something new disbelief. The senior officer shook his head firmly, cutting the junior officer off mid-sentence. His tone was sharp, leaving no room for argument. "Elijah is not a thief," he stated, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "He had nothing to do with the theft." Then, his next words landed like a thunderclap in the small room. "Elijah is the son of the police chief." The weight of that revelation hit the junior officer like a brick wall. His once confident demeanor crumbled instantly, giving way to visible panic. His face paled, his breath hitching as the gravity of his mistake became painfully clear. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The junior officer opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He stammered incoherently, his earlier bravado evaporating in an instant, replaced by sheer panic. The room once filled with his relentless accusations and Elijah's tearful protests fell into an uneasy silence. His gaze, which had once carried the weight of authority, now shifted toward Elijah, but it no longer held power. Instead, it was laced with desperation. Elijah, still trembling in his chair, looked up at the two officers. His tear-streaked face was a mixture of exhaustion and confusion, his swollen eyes darting between them, trying to understand what was happening. The junior officer's mind raced, struggling to process the gravity of what he had done. The junior officer replayed his actions over the past hour in his mind, the pepper spray, the rough handling, the relentless accusations, and the complete disregard for the boy's denials. Each memory now filled him with dread as the full extent of his mistake became clear. He hadn't just mistreated a child, he had mistreated the son of the most powerful figure in their precinct. Desperation took hold of him. His mind scrambled for a way to salvage the situation, but no solution came. The confidence he had carried so easily before, built on prejudice and unchecked authority, now felt like quicksand beneath his feet, pulling him deeper into a mistake he could not undo. The junior officer glanced nervously at the senior officer, searching for any sign of leniency, but the firm set of the senior officer's jaw made it clear none would be given. Without another word, the senior officer turned back to Elijah, his expression softening once more. When he spoke, his voice was calm and reassuring, a stark contrast to the harsh interrogation Elijah had endured just moments earlier. Elijah, still overwhelmed by the events of the day, could only nod weakly in response. His body trembled from exhaustion, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The room remained thick with tension as the gravity of what had happened settled over everyone, the silence stretching between them heavy, inescapable, and unforgiving. The junior officer stood frozen, his mind consumed by the damning reel of his own actions. Every decision, every assumption, every cruel word replayed with haunting clarity. He had assumed guilt based on bias alone, ignoring the complete lack of evidence and disregarding the boy's desperate protests. The truth was undeniable now, and with it came the crushing realization not only had he been wrong, but he had also acted with outright cruelty and a total disregard for justice. Panic tightened around him like a vice. The walls of the small interrogation room seemed to close in, suffocating him under the weight of his mistakes. Before he could fumble for an excuse, before he could utter a plea for leniency, the door to the room swung open once more. The door to the station swung open with force, and the police chief himself strode into the room. His commanding presence instantly silenced the tense, suffocating space. The weight of his authority was undeniable. The senior officer who had been standing near the wall immediately straightened his posture, his expression unreadable. The junior officer, however, remained frozen in place, his already pale face draining of any remaining color. The chief's sharp eyes swept across the room, quickly assessing the situation. Then, they landed on Elijah. Seated in the interrogation chair, the boy's tear-streaked face, trembling hands, and hunched posture told the chief everything he needed to know. The damage had already been done. The police chief took in the scene before him, and in an instant, he understood everything his son had endured. A wave of fury surged through him, his jaw tightening as he stepped further into the room. His usual air of authority was now laced with something deeper, something personal. Without hesitation, he moved directly to Elijah, crouching slightly to meet his son's eyes. For a brief moment, the hardness in his expression softened, his protective instincts overtaking his initial shock. Elijah blinked up at him, his swollen eyes filled with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The chief placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder, offering silent reassurance he was safe now. But as his gaze shifted back to the junior officer, the warmth in his expression disappeared, replaced by a cold, simmering anger. As the police chief took in the rest of the room, his demeanor shifted. The fury that had simmered beneath the surface finally erupted as he turned his gaze toward the junior officer who stood frozen near the table. His booming voice cut through the tense silence, demanding an explanation. The The walls of the small room seemed to tremble under the weight of his anger. The junior officer flinched at the sound, his confidence shattered. His mouth opened and closed as he struggled to form a coherent response. He stammered out a weak apology, his words disjointed and hurried. His voice wavered as he tried to explain, claiming that it had all been a mistake, that he hadn't realized who Elijah was. The junior officer scrambled to justify his actions, insisting that he hadn't meant any harm, that it had all been a misunderstanding. He claimed he hadn't realized who Elijah was, as if that somehow excused everything. But the chief's anger only deepened. His expression darkened as he abruptly cut through the man's rambling, his voice sharp and unyielding. "This isn't about who he is," the chief said, his words slicing through the weak excuses like a blade. "The problem isn't his identity. The problem is your blatant racial bias and your appalling treatment of a child." His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, each syllable landing with force. "You ignored every piece of evidence," the chief continued, his gaze locking onto the junior officer, "because you had already decided he was guilty before you even saw him." The chief didn't hold back. His words were sharp, unwavering. "You didn't arrest him because of evidence," he said coldly. "You jumped to conclusions based on nothing more than the color of his skin." The accusation hung heavy in the air, a damning indictment that left no room for argument. The room grew more tense with every word the chief spoke. The junior officer, now visibly shaken, scrambled for a defense. His voice trembled as he pleaded for leniency, insisting that his actions hadn't been intentional. He claimed he had acted in the heat of the moment, that it had all been a misunderstanding, but his words rang hollow in the face of the truth. There was no excuse, no justification that could undo what he had done. Elijah remained silent throughout the confrontation, his wide eyes darting between his father and the junior officer. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his emotions a tangled mix of lingering fear and awe at the sight of his father's unwavering defense. As the argument escalated, the junior officer's tone shifted. No longer defensive, it became outright pleading. Desperation laced his voice as he turned to Elijah, his words trembling. "Please," he begged, "don't tell your father what happened." But it was far too late for that. The truth had already been laid bare, exposed for all to see. And Elijah's silence, heavy and unyielding, only made that truth more damning. Elijah's silence only underscored the gravity of the situation. The chief, unmoved by the junior officer's desperation, spoke with a finality that left no room for debate. "Your actions are unforgivable." His voice was firm, resolute. The weight of his authority bore down on the disgraced officer like an unshakable verdict. Without hesitation, he ordered the junior officer's immediate termination, making it clear that there was no place in law enforcement for someone who acted with such prejudice and cruelty. But the chief didn't stop there. He vowed that the officer's misconduct would not be buried or forgotten. It would be reported widely, ensuring that no reputable department would ever consider employing him again. The consequences of his actions would follow him far beyond the walls of this station. The chief continued, his voice unwavering. "Your actions didn't just violate the standards of this department, they betrayed the fundamental principles of justice and humanity." The disgraced officer stood in stunned silence as the weight of those words settled over him. His earlier arrogance had completely vanished, replaced by a deep and growing sense of dread. He glanced at Elijah, searching for some sign of mercy, some hope of reprieve, but the boy's tearful gaze remained fixed on the ground, offering nothing. There was no forgiveness to be found here. The chief exhaled sharply, his anger controlled but undeniable. Without another word, he gestured toward the door, signaling the end of the officer's career. The chief's gesture left no room for argument. The officer was finished. Moments later, another officer entered the room to escort the disgraced man out of the station. The junior officer's head hung low as he shuffled toward the door, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the heavy silence, each step a reminder of the consequences of his actions. When the door finally closed behind him, the tension in the room seemed to shift. The chief turned back to Elijah, his expression softening once more. Kneeling beside his son, he placed a gentle hand on Elijah's shoulder, his voice low and reassuring as he spoke. The chief's voice was low, steady, and filled with genuine regret. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," he said, his tone heavy with emotion. "No one should ever have to go through what you just experienced. I promise you, justice will be served." His words brought a small measure of comfort to Elijah. Slowly he nodded, his tear-streaked face beginning to relax, if only slightly. His hands, which had been tightly clasped in his lap, loosened as he took a deep, shaky breath. The weight of fear and helplessness that had consumed him just moments ago seemed to ease, if only for a moment. For the chief, the sight of his son in such a state was a painful reminder of the work that still needed to be done. He resolved, then and there, that change was not just necessary, it was long overdue. The chief knew that his responsibility didn't end here. It wasn't enough to address the immediate situation. Real change was needed to ensure that something like this never happened again. Elijah had been through a harrowing ordeal, one that had left emotional scars that would take time to heal. But as he looked up at his father, standing tall and unwavering in his defense, a small glimmer of hope flickered inside him. Justice had been served. And for the first time since the nightmare had begun, the crushing weight of the injustice he had endured began to lift. The chief stayed by Elijah's side a while longer, making sure his son felt safe. He knew that no words could undo what had happened, but at least now, Elijah wasn't facing it alone. As they left the station together, the chief's protective arm rested gently on Elijah's shoulder, a silent promise that he would always stand by him. Elijah still carried the weight of what had happened, but with his father beside him, he no longer felt alone. The night had been long, painful, and unjust, but justice had prevailed, and as they stepped outside, the cool air against his tear-streaked face, Elijah took a deep breath, knowing that while the scars of this ordeal would take time to heal, he had someone who would always fight for him. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.